memory was just complete. I couldn't remember, and kind of forming full sentences was a struggle. I couldn't find words. I couldn't feel words. What do you mean you couldn't feel words?
It's a really weird thing because it's not just, I mean, at that point, everything felt a bit weird anyway, but when I think about the next few weeks, especially, I think I've always related words to emotions so much. And so, you know, there are certain words that will make you feel certain things, but I couldn't feel anything. Language just didn't have an impact on me at that point, and mainly because I just didn't know how many words I had lost. They told my husband that she's got to read, write and talk in order to get her language skills back. And, you know, I've got this notebook which my husband bought me, and the first page, there's just a handful of words. And I remember writing those handful of words and thinking, oh, these are all the words in the world. There's no more. So I'm totally fine. I remember thinking that.
Do you remember what any of those words were?
On the first page, it was kind of me writing my name, writing, you know, our door number, writing my husband's name. I wrote something like, I love him very much, things like that. Very basic things, but for some reason, like I didn't realise how many words I had lost.
That is amazing, and it's so interesting to hear which words you chose, because they're words about relationships and feelings.
Yeah. But also they're very kind of, they were, you know, they're very practical things like my name, my husband's name, my mum's name. But, you know, the line about me loving my husband, you know, that's got this, you know, emotional element to it. But when I did start focusing on the emotion of language, that's when it kind of really flooded back.
Oh, tell me more.
A couple of weeks after the operation, you know, there is one page in particular where I've just basically been open about emotions and how I'm feeling, which I hadn't done before. The moment I started writing about how I'm feeling, it's just floods of words and full sentences, which I wasn't writing in before.
What about when you tried speaking in those days after the operation? What would happen?
It was really hard to speak. I remember a couple of times, I mean, this happened a few times, and it's just the scariest thing in the world. Either I'd be trying to talk and full sentences won't form, and it felt like my brain just disconnected from itself, and so an anxiety attack would hit. And then what would happen is that my lips felt like they'd lock. I couldn't speak, I couldn't swallow, I couldn't see words.
Presumably you had a speech therapist with you at the time. What would your speech therapist say to you?
On the last day when I was in hospital, I was told by multiple doctors that you can go home today. But then a speech therapist came, and she was asking me questions which at the time, I didn't know until later what those questions were exactly, but at that time, I felt like they were the hardest questions in the world. You know, she'd say to me, can you point at the window? And I would point at the door. Or she'd say, are you wearing a hat? And apparently I put my hand on my head and I said, yes, I'm wearing a hat, even though I wasn't. I was really getting angry. It was like she's deliberately asking me really hard questions. Like, I don't know why she's doing that. And, you know, she basically, even though all the other doctors had told me I can go home, she called my husband and basically said that, you know, your wife is really impaired and she can't go home. She needs a lot of work. Anyway, the moment he came, I just stood up and I was like, let's go. And he was like, no, we're not going home today. And he kept saying that to me. And because I wasn't able to tell him, you know, fully that, you know, this doctor said that I can go home, this doctor, I couldn't tell him full sentences. And I kept trying to get the words down, the words weren't coming out. And he just wouldn't listen to me. And I got really frustrated. And in that frustration, I swore at him in Punjabi. And that's like a full sentence of Punjabi came out. And he laughed so much. And I, you know, his face was just like, she seems fine to me. What's happening here?
Brilliant.
I just wanted to get up and keep going. Apparently 6 weeks after my operation, I was on a Zoom call with Nimo Ismail, who's the director of Wordplay, like, yeah, I'm ready to get back into this.
6 weeks later, having spent some time unable to find any words at all, you can go back to writing.
Yes. It's insane. I think, you know, if you break your leg, you kind of know when you're better, when you can start walking or whatever. With a brain tumor, it's very difficult to know, because if I could remember a few more words than yesterday, I feel like, oh, I'm better now. And not realizing that actually there's a lot of recovery to go through. And, you know, so when I did start, like, going back into the Royal Court Theatre, I used to get lost on my way and I couldn't read a map. I couldn't read the tube maps. But because I was like, okay, I can walk for longer now without needing to sit down, or I can form full sentences now, so therefore I'm better.
When you did start writing this play, were you still in the, or go back to writing the play that you've been commissioned to write, were you still in the process of having to remember words that you had forgotten?
Yes, yeah. What became quite noticeable to me, though, was that in speaking words, that was a bit harder, but in writing them, it just was a little bit easier. And so, one of the days when I was with the team and, we were just talking about the play and just kind of getting back to it, they left me in the room for a little while just to do a free writing exercise. And it ended up being one of the scenes in the play, which exists in the play right now. And it was, the free writing exercise was just me unpacking my emotions. And, there's something in that scene which basically just talks about cracks and cracking. And it was a really kind of open way of just unpacking what I was feeling at that time.
So you felt like you were cracking?
I felt like I was cracking. I felt like I was really cracking for the longest time. Not just in the terms of the operation, but it's been so hard for so many years before that all of a sudden I was sitting and I was thinking about all of that, and then I was thinking about the operation, I was thinking about the after effects of the operation, I was thinking about this particular moment, and I just felt like I've been cracking for so long that I'm holding on to like various cracks in my body. Like I didn't feel like I haven't completely cracked open or anything like that, but I'm definitely carrying lots of cracks inside of myself.
And those wounds, those cracks, have they healed now?
I mean, you carry these things with you. I'm always still scared that I'm going to get the brain tumor again. I'm always still scared that I'll never write again. All of those things still sit with you. Having said that, I think one of my ways of coping after the operation and the recovery was just to make jokes, which I did a lot of. And I use the brain tumor to get away with everything as well. Like, just ask my husband or my friends. It's just like, oh my God, for God's sake. That's become a coping thing. But like, if I didn't have the commission from the Royal Court there, if I didn't know I had a play on it, life would have been very difficult. So it's like, I consider myself really lucky. And so for me, having that has meant that I've been able to continue going.
During that period when words weren't coming at all easily, what did you learn about the importance of language in our lives?
I think the biggest thing for me was the power of words. Even saying words to ourselves, reminding ourselves of things that can change your emotions so strongly. So for me, it just really showed more than ever your choice of words around certain things, around certain subjects, those matter. And so in writing this play, about political language, it really brought home to me that words don't just kind of sit around and they're not just said and you forget about them. They land in places, they land in us, they land around us, and that means they have an impact. So it was just a really big reminder of that.
Having lost so many words at one point, if you were to go back down to one word now, have you ever thought about what that word would be, the one word you want to preserve above all others in any language?
That's a really, really good question. I might need a second to think about that.
Yeah,
that's a very, very good question. I think, thinking about it right now, I think I'm going to go back to that word raza in Urdu. From the poem and the line is, Bata teri raza kya hai? Tell me what is your contentment. There's something in that word raza and the word contentment which is open. It's not about just one moment. It's not about one moment of happiness. It's about what you want from life. What is your bigger vision? What is your long-term goals? I think there's something about the word raza that kind of, I think, will remind me of everything I want from life and all the things I've worked really hard for, and it's just to know that journey for contentment is continual. And so, Bata teri raza kya hai? Like that's an open-ended question for me, but at the same time it's knowing the parameters within which that exists, and that definitely has everything to do with writing for me.
Rabia Hussain, her latest play is called Wordplay, and it's on in London for another couple of weeks. After the news, stories from a Chinese garden and a burning temple. Stay with us. This is Outlook on the BBC World Service.
This is the BBC World Service, where Kevin Fong talks to the team taking us back to the moon, more than 50 years after we last set foot on it.
The mission is called Artemis, and it's ambitious, with plans for an orbiting lunar space station and a moon base which might one day serve as a staging post for missions to Mars.
The missions for Apollo, I think many of you know, was a race against the Soviet Union at that time.
That's one small step for man.
Artemis is about a sustainable presence on the lunar surface.
It's really exciting because what we want to do is learn how to live and work outside the protection of the Earth's magnetic field.
100 years ago, if we talked about going to the moon, you would have thought we were crazy, and yet we were on the moon not much more than 40 years after that, so Mars doesn't seem that distant.
Humans are explorers. It's in our nature.
The Engineers, Lunar Exploration. Today at 9 GMT.
In part 2 of Outlook, Huan Shu was intrigued by a story about his great-great-grandfather.
When the Sino-Japanese War broke out, the Japanese were on the verge of occupying his town. So the family had to flee, but before the family fled, my great-great-grandfather and his workmen dug a huge hole in their garden and wrapped up all of their valuables, including this big porcelain collection, covered the vault, and fled.
And there began an adventure. His story after the BBC World Service News.
BBC News with David Harper. North Korea has said the American soldier who crossed into the country from the south last month had wanted to seek refuge. In Pyongyang's first comments on Travis King, state media said he'd harboured ill feeling against the US Army. The UN says more than 1 million people have now fled Sudan as aid workers warn that the crisis there is spiralling out of control. It follows 4 months of war between the country's rival military factions. Several West African migrants have been found dead aboard a boat drifting off Cape Verde, along with around 40 survivors. The exact number of casualties is unconfirmed. The boat had reportedly set off from Senegal a month ago, heading for the Spanish Canary Islands. President Biden says he will travel to Hawaii as soon as he can, amid criticism of his response to the deadly wildfires there. Mr. Biden said he hadn't yet visited the island state because of concerns that doing so would divert resources away from the humanitarian response. A former senior FBI counterintelligence officer has pleaded guilty in the US to taking money from a sanctioned Russian oligarch in exchange for information on a rival. Charles McGonigal was described as the former top spy catcher in New York. At least 11 people have died in an explosion at a shop in the Dominican Republic. The cause is unclear. Google has announced plans to train 20,000 Nigerian women and young people in digital skills to support government targets of creating 1 million tech jobs. The firm said it would also donate $1.6 million. Scientists say that for the first time they've reconstructed a song by analysing recordings of brainwaves. They used artificial intelligence to decode recordings of epilepsy patients who listened to a song by the band Pink Floyd. The researchers hope their work could help people with impaired speech from strokes and other brain injuries speak more naturally via improved implants and other assistive technologies. BBC News.
Welcome back to Outlook. Hello, I'm Jo Fidgen. We're going to get you in the mood in this part of the programme for a special season starting next week on the theme of Lost and Found. And in the meantime, we've selected a couple of stories from the archive. The first from 2015, when Matthew Bannister spoke to Huan Shu, an American journalist who went looking for one thing and found something even more precious. Huan grew up in Salt Lake City in Utah, ignoring his Chinese heritage entirely, until he heard an old family story about buried treasure that piqued his interest.
If my family had ever talked about it when I was a kid, I didn't pay any attention to that because as a kid I wasn't interested in anything Chinese. I think I was a typical child of immigrants in that I was more focused on assimilation.
So did you actively turn your back on your Chinese heritage?
Yeah, it wasn't just that I was disinterested. I was actively rejecting the Chinese heritage. So I refused to speak Chinese. In a lot of diaspora communities, there's this weekend Chinese school that kids are sent to sort of keep those traditions of reading and writing and culture alive. And I complained so loudly and so incessantly every week that my parents finally just said, okay, you don't have to go, which of course I regretted once I went to China and couldn't speak or read.
So when did the treasure story really come to the forefront of your mind?
I found out about it when I was living in Seattle, and I went to the Seattle Art Museum to write a story for a newspaper that I was working for, and I just happened to stumble into their porcelain room. I fixated on this little red dish, and then there were some Chinese characters on the dish. So I phoned up my father just to ask what it was. He translated it for me, and it wasn't anything that interesting. But then he said, well, you know, if you're interested in porcelain, you should talk to your mom, because her family had some porcelain.
And what was the story?
My great-great-grandfather was something of a scholar in a little Yangtze village called Xingang. And
what period of time was this?
And this would have been late 19th century, early 20th century.
So this is Imperial China.
Yeah, so, you know, as a man of means and education, he did what a lot of people did and patronized the arts. His thing was porcelain, and so he collected a lot of porcelain, and it was said to be very beautiful and very valuable. And then, you know, when the Sino-Japanese War broke out, the Japanese were on the verge of occupying his town, so the family had to flee, but before the family fled, my great-great-grandfather and his workmen dug a huge hole in their garden, a vault basically, and lined it with bamboo shelving and wrapped up all of their valuables, including this big porcelain collection, covered the vault, replanted the garden, and fled. And nobody could tell me what had happened to it or what might have happened to it.
So there was no story of somebody going back and digging it up?
No, nothing like that.
So as far as you were concerned, it was still there? Right.
Yeah.
So why did this story grab your imagination so much?
Well, I think it's just a good old-fashioned treasure hunt. When I was a kid, I collected baseball cards and comics. I always had these fantasies of finding, like, this super valuable Honus Wagner tobacco card in a garage sale, or, you know, Spider-Man issue #1 in the bottom of a drawer somewhere.
So you set off to China. How did you set about trying to track down this buried treasure?
Well, the first source that I consulted was my grandmother, whose grandfather was the one who buried the porcelain, and she had moved back to Shanghai.
And what was her reaction when you arrived, when you turned up on the doorstep and started asking questions?
Well, I think she was happy to see me, but our communication was kind of limited at first. Her English was not that good, and my Chinese was really bad. And it turned out that she had already left home by the time the porcelain was buried, though she confirmed the size of the collection and its apparent value.
Which was what? Enormous value?
My grandmother said it was quite valuable. And then as I started talking to other relatives, I noticed that their memories of the porcelain and also of the family's wealth kind of reflected their own desires for the family mythology. So one grand aunt, my grandmother's cousin in Taiwan, who was married to a Kuomintang or nationalist officer, you know, her memories were completely gilded. I mean, the family was so aristocratic, the family was so bourgeois, and if we had just had one little bowl from that collection, we'd be millionaires. And then her cousins, who stayed on the mainland, perhaps out of, you know, decades of needing to downplay their bourgeois roots, remembered it slightly differently.
Did you eventually find out the location of this collection?
I did.
And did you go there?
I did.
What was it like?
It was not quite what I had envisioned. I mean, I think I had these naive fantasies of this Indiana Jones type adventure where I would be swashbuckling through the Chinese hinterlands. And it was actually quite developed. And there was a 50s era cotton factory that had been built on part of my great-great-grandfather's property, which presented kind of a problem.
Because you wanted to start digging, presumably.
Yeah, and that was part of my fantasy, that I would just show up with a shovel.
There was a cotton factory there.
Yeah.
Did you have to go and ask somebody if you could start digging?
I did. I had to devise some plan to try and dig. So we went to go find the manager of the cotton factory. I said, I have some relatives who are going to be visiting from overseas in a few weeks, which was true. And they're going to want to come and see the old family property. And I would like to beautify it before they come. So I'd like to plant some trees and flowers for them on this vacant land, which you're not using anyway. And I just thought, what a slam dunk.
And you didn't feel that you should tell him the truth, that there might be buried treasure underneath there?
No. No, I thought we would deal with the buried treasure if we found anything.
Right, okay. So did he buy this excuse?
He didn't. He said, well, this has been a cotton factory for as long as I've been alive. I don't know what it was before it was a cotton factory. And I also don't want you leaving anything that might give me trouble later on. And of course, that was infuriating and disappointing, and I kind of hated him for refusing me. But then imagine a Chinese guy showing up in downtown San Francisco and saying, like, hey, you know what? In your backyard, there might be some stuff of mine because, you know, my great-great-great-grandfather came here during the gold rush. So how about it?
You get the bum's rush, wouldn't
Yeah,
you?
exactly. Yeah. So eventually, through a long negotiation, we convinced the manager to let us plant the trees. I would take some photos of them in the ground, and then after I took the photos of them, I would take them out, and then I would show the photos to my relatives.
Right, I'm on the edge of my seat now. So you started digging. Did you find any porcelain?
I did find some porcelain, actually. I mean, the thing about China is that there's porcelain everywhere.
Right. Was there a vault?
I did not find a vault.
Weren't you very, very disappointed?
I was slightly disappointed, but of course, there was a lot more land that I had not dug on, so the possibility of it still being in the ground was preserved.
And what did you learn about your family? Were there things that you revealed to yourself about your family that perhaps you hadn't known before and that were interesting to you?
Just about everything that I learned about my family was interesting because I knew so little.
So it did reconnect you with your Chinese roots?
It did reconnect me to my Chinese roots, and the realization I think I came to at the end of the journey was that I'm probably always going to feel American in China and Chinese in America, but that has its benefits. I think when I was younger, the kind of marginalization of being a minority was really troubling. But once I saw the other side of being a minority, I kind of saw that it was an opportunity to move smoothly between two countries and two cultures. And so instead of closing off one world for another, I gained access to both.
Huan Shu speaking to Matthew Bannister. This is Outlook. Our final story today is about losing people and finding peace. In the Black Rock Desert in Nevada, once a year, people gather for the Burning Man Festival. Tradition has it that on the final day, a huge and ornately carved temple is set on fire, and along with it, mementos and messages that people have placed inside it for their lost loved ones. It's a kind of grieving process. Many of these temples have been designed by an established sculptor called David Best. In 2015, he took time out from building a temple in Northern Ireland to tell our reporter Nicky Paxman how he'd started making these temples for Burning Man.
I had gone to Burning Man a couple times, and I'm a junk sculptor. Next to my studio was a toy factory that made dinosaurs, plywood dinosaur puzzles, and they had scrap. And I thought, this is a great, interesting material to use to burn, so I thought I'd build something. And I'd been working with a young artist, a young kid who was just getting out of trouble, just starting to blossom. And I was like a father kind of role model to him. And about 2 weeks before Burning Man, he went out on his motorcycle and was killed at 140 miles an hour. So at the cemetery, his friend said, Michael would have wanted us to continue. And as we were building, it became a tribute to their friend that had died. And in addition to that, maybe 100 people came up who had lost someone and put names in it. And we very unceremoniously burn it. And the next year, Burning Man asked me to come back and build a temple. And that year, 10,000 people put names in the temple. And it became thousands of people crying. That temple was called the Temple of Tears.
What was it made of, and how big was the Temple of Tears?
It was all plywood. It looked pretty much like maybe you would interpret it as a Balinese or maybe even a Jain temple in India. Maybe 60, 70 feet tall. I think the tallest one I've ever done was 90.
And 10,000 people left what? Left mementos, left messages?
Names, pictures, ashes.
Ashes of dead bodies?
Yeah. I mean, people just don't have a place to put their parents' ashes. I actually took my mother and father and put their ashes in the temple. And I'm not a, quote, burner. You know, I don't think of myself as a real Burning Man person.
But it's interesting you say you don't think of yourself as a Burning Man. I should describe the festival. I've never been, but what I imagine it to be is a huge gathering of people who are putting on performances, music. They're in the desert, they're camping, and they're building things, running around in the clothing of their choice, or not very much clothing. And there is this inherent ritual to burn things, and then it's called Burning Man because at the very end of the week-long festival, a huge effigy of a man is burnt. But what's the point of the burning? Do people find some sort of emotional release in it?
For many people, I mean, when the man burns, which is on a Saturday night, it's people twirling fire on stilts, 5,000 naked women and men running with fire dancers. Saturday night, there's a tremendous celebration. It's a beautiful thing. Sunday night, when we burn the temple, it's just the reverse. You can hear 40,000 people. You can whistle. It's so silent. And when the temple burns, there's a release.
And part of the point, part of the ritual of making these temples is that you make them with large teams of volunteers.
When I work, I usually have probably average, at the final builds, maybe 100 people working, all volunteer. I have a kitchen. My wife does the cooking for average 100 people a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But the only precautions I take on my crew is that I have a strict rule of zero tolerance for drinking and smoking. I have people that work with me that are in recovery programs. I make an environment, safe environment for somebody to learn how to use tools, how to be somewhere and express themselves in a safe place. So to give you a cross-section of my crew, on Juneau, Temple of Juneau, I had a father whose daughter fell off a cliff. I had a woman whose daughter fell off the same cliff, both working on the temple together. I had a young man who had attempted to commit suicide 3 times. I had a woman whose father had just died. These people all come to this project with various needs, either to be healed or to heal other people.
Well, you are creating then a very spiritual and emotionally charged space. But for you as an artist, where do you think the idea for the sort of the shape and the form of the temples came from in the first place? I mean, you say they kind of look a little bit Balinese, maybe a little bit Indian. Where did that come from in you?
My rules when I'm drawing is to make something that can be built by 100 people with all different skills. So it's got to be kind of simple and yet look ornate.
Well, they do look very ornate, don't they? I mean, I think the 2003 Temple of Honor, which was made of paper, in fact, you could describe it as a soaring sort of series of filigree onion domes. I mean, the carvings, the sort of the cutout patterns in the materials of the walls are incredibly intricate.
And I had, if you can imagine, 10 really butch carpenters with carpenter belts on in a tent with small scissors cutting out pieces of paper. It was like a sewing circle.
What are they like inside? I mean, I've got pictures of them largely from the outside.
Really pretty. It was like going into if we were to close our eyes and imagine 100,000 shapes all put together into a really beautiful chandelier, so that if you were to close your eyes, I'm closing mine, trying to figure out how to tell someone what it looks like. It's very gentle, surprisingly gentle. The whole idea of a place that's so busy and so ornate that it becomes calm.
And it's busy with what? Is it busy with light and shadows coming through the carvings out in the walls?
In the daytime, the light comes from the desert, filtering through like a lattice structure. At night, there's a light that glows in them. They're lit softly. When it's first finished, you can walk in it easily. Once the temple belongs to the community, once it's opened up, the beauty goes into a different form. It's very hard to walk into it without crying. You're walking up and you're seeing somebody write, "I miss you, Grandpa," or "I'm sorry," or "I hate you for what you did to me, but I'll forgive you."
And presumably it fills up as the days go by before it's burned.
It gets absolutely packed, thousands and thousands of things. And when the temple's burnt, everyone thinks that the reason it's burning so brightly is what they put into it. That picture of their mother or that note makes that extra special spirit in it, right? That's what the essence of the build is.
Because for every message that says "I love you" or "I hate you" or "I forgive you" or "I can't forgive you," there's an enormously powerful story.
Yeah.
But at this very moment, there's a huge temple called, quite simply, Temple, that you and a crew of volunteers have created in Derry, Londonderry, in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland has been a place of conflict and troubles in the latter part of the 20th century. Is this a more political temple than ones you've made before?
Well, I made a real point to come to Ireland not to try to confront that issue, but to offer an alternative that cross communities could build a temple together and burn it on the 21st of March and represent a healing and forgiveness.
As an artist, what is it like putting all this effort, the emotional effort, building the crew, building the temple, knowing that it's ephemeral, the whole point is it's going to disappear, it's going to be burned?
That's real simple for me. I used to do big paintings. I did ceramics, prints. I still do a lot of printing. I do automobiles. I've done 35 decorated cars. I'm in the basement of the San Francisco Museum. I'm in the basement of the San Jose Museum. I'm in basements of museums. Now, we go to a man who came up to me whose son had committed suicide, and he said, "You set my son free." What he meant, who knows? But that healing that he experienced, to build a temple that makes someone feel like that, that's a pretty permanent piece of art.
David Best of Nevada's Burning Man Festival, speaking to Outlook's Nikki Paxman. Thanks for your company today. Outlook's back, same time tomorrow. Hope to see you then.
You're listening to the BBC World Service and now Witness History. Today, we're taking you back 70 years to the 15th of August 1953 when a coup took place in Iran. The United States, with assistance from the British, overthrew Iran's Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and reinstated the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, as the nation's leader. In 2010, Alan Johnson spoke to the grandson of the former Prime Minister, Hedayat Mateen Daftari.
It is mid-August 1953, and the Iranian monarch, the Shah, has just moved to sack his Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. But all is not quite as it seems. The CIA is deeply involved, so involved, in fact, that its agents have even written the decree ordering Mr. Mossadegh's dismissal.
For security reasons, we did the actual writing of the thing. I had a guy who wrote perfect Persian, and we drafted it and then delivered it to the Shah.
Kermit Roosevelt, the grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, was the chief American agent in Tehran, and he was engineering a coup. The U.S. wanted to leave the pro-Western Shah in complete control of his oil-rich nation. Part of the plan involved installing a new government that would be headed by a Shah loyalist, General Fazlollah Zahedi. But in the gathering tension, there was a danger that the general might be arrested before the coup. So Agent Roosevelt stepped in personally and made sure his man was safe.
I went and got him from the apartment and took him under a rug in the back of a car to this fellow agency man's house. And we put him in the cellar there, and he was not disturbed.
The coup's decisive moment was to be an attack on Prime Minister Mossadegh's residence and offices. It would involve troops loyal to the Shah and a mob recruited in Tehran's bazaar, and mobilizing that crowd would require the spending of some cash.
We gave some money to our principal agents. They said they wouldn't need much, but that they would like to have some, and we gave them $70,000, and that was the total amount spent. I think that they paid it to various key characters. For one thing, the Zircone, the strong man, the muscle, the weightlifters, they led in the march, and I think that they were paid some small sum.
The coup came after a long period of growing tension between the West and Prime Minister Mossadegh. He had been determined to secure as much of Iran's oil wealth as possible for his people. In order to do that, he had nationalized the British-run Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Britain was furious, and it imposed sanctions that prevented the Iranians producing and exporting any oil. At the same time, London helped persuade Washington that in the depths of the Cold War, there was a risk that Iran would drift into the communist camp, and America decided to act. Mr. Mossadegh had significant support among the urban masses, but he had also alienated powerful elements in Iranian society, and the CIA judged that it could easily bring the government down if it provoked a confrontation between the Prime Minister and the Shah. Mr. Mossadegh's grandson, Hedayat Mateen Daftari, was a student on holiday in Tehran during that summer of 1953, and he remembers what happened when the CIA plot reached its climax.
Everything was normal until midday, and suddenly we heard there were people shooting and lots of noise and all that.
Where were the shots coming from?
Well, we were very close to my grandfather's house. We lived very close to my grandfather's house. When the whole siege had begun and we had realized, my cousin went to the Prime Minister's house and office and brought my grandmother and some of her servants with her to our place. And after that, we couldn't get through anymore. There was a siege all over the place, and from all roads and passages, soldiers, tanks, heavy firearm. My uncle's house, it was in fact bombarded by a tank. The tank went in and shot up the roof completely, you know.
You must have been extremely worried that your grandfather was going to be killed in all this.
Well, we were worried for his life, and not only for his life, for the life of the others with him, ministers and others, some of his guards. They were defending the place, and we were worried for all of them. But at one point, my grandfather decided that there should be no bloodshed. Mossadegh was a peaceful person, and that's when they decided to come out with a white flag so that the soldiers and officers who were defending the office, they would be saved, although some were killed. In fact, one of his bodyguards was also killed, who was behind the door in his room.
And so did he emerge onto the street with a white flag? Or
there was no, they showed the white flag from the window on the second floor, and then they decided that they should leave the house through the backyard and over the wall to the house of a neighbor, and they did that. And one of the people who was with him, an army colonel, many years later, he said, I could see behind me looters had been brought and they were looting the house. But they were so involved in looting that they didn't see us going up the ladder. We just passed through safely into a neighbor's house, and from there into another neighbor's house, eventually arriving at a third neighbor's house where they stayed for the night.
And the looting continued in the Prime Minister's residence and offices?
Yes, looting continued in the most ferocious manner. They even took out the windows and doors. The looters were paid to come and loot, and they were very happy to loot. Absolutely ignorant people. One scene which is always before my eyes was my grandmother had a sewing machine, one of those tall ones which had wheels underneath, and someone was pushing it along the pavement and past our front door. I was watching him. They did not know what they were doing. They did not know that they were, in fact, hitting at the roots of their own political institutions and democracy, and they were looting.
Within days, the ousted Prime Minister was arrested. He was put on trial and jailed. Later, he was allowed to return to his home, but kept under house arrest until his death in 1963. Mr. Mossadegh's grandson remembers the old man during those last years of his life, reflecting on his downfall.
Of course, he knew who'd done it and how it'd been done. And he was very unhappy that the Iranian officers who have to defend the integrity of Iran, including its laws and including its institutions, were involved in this. This was the point which, more than anything else, made him suffer. Involvement of Iranian officers, Not so much those who were the old British hands who collaborated with MI6 and later on with CIA. I mean, in planning and bringing out those army officers who betrayed their own government and their own people and the rule of law in Iran.
In 1953, the US and Britain achieved their goals in Iran. After the coup, the Shah reigned supreme until he in turn was brought down by the Islamic Revolution of 1979. But the ousting of the Mossadegh government is now widely seen as having been a serious blow to Iran's faltering steps towards democracy at the time. And the coup, which is almost forgotten in the West now, contributed very significantly to a deep and enduring suspicion among many Iranians of British and American motives.
Alan Johnston was speaking to Hedayat Mateen Daftari for that edition of Witness History, first broadcast in 2010.
This is the BBC World Service with Harriet Gilbert to tell us about the next World Book Club.
American author Audrey Niffenegger talks about her best-selling novel, The Time Traveler's Wife, a magical love story with a twist. Funny, quirky, and sometimes heartbreaking, this is the story of a relationship lived in the moment. Moments that are all in the wrong order.
World Book Club from the 2nd of September. In 30 minutes, we're on the podium.
With me, Eliza Skinner, Paralympian Scout Bassett, and the BBC's athletics commentator, Ed Harry. We'll be meeting Argentine Santiago Lange, who not only beat lung cancer and returned to the waters to win sailing gold in Rio, but is now aiming for an 8th appearance at an Olympic Games.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
This is Alex Ritson with the newsroom. North Korea asserts US soldier Travis King crossed the border after becoming disillusioned with America.
They said that Travis King had crossed into the north because he had been inhumanely treated in the army and racially discriminated against.
Poland shows off its military might as war rages close to its eastern border.
We consider this Russian aggression as a threat also to our territory. When we support Ukraine, we do it out of our national interest because we know that we are next in line.
Meanwhile, prisoners of war returned to Ukraine complain of torture by their Russian captors. Donald Trump pledges to reveal information that he says will exonerate him from criminal charges. And listening to someone thinking about Pink Floyd. This really is the sound of those brainwaves. We'll speak to the scientist who recorded them. First, this news.
Hello, I'm David Harper with the BBC News. North Korea has said the American soldier who crossed into the country from the south last month had wanted to seek refuge. Private King ran across a heavily fortified border with South Korea while on a civilian tour of the area. The details from our Seoul correspondent, Jean Mackenzie.
Travis King was serving here in South Korea, and he was in trouble with the authorities here and with the army. He was due to be sent back to the US, where he was going to be disciplined by the army and possibly even discharged. And so he chose not to get on that flight back to the US, and he booked onto this tour when he dashed across. And also, Travis King's family gave an interview to ABC News in America just a couple of weeks ago, and in that interview, they said that Travis King had suggested, when they'd spoken to him on the phone, that he had experienced some racism in the military, and that his mental health had deteriorated up until that moment in which he crossed.
The United Nations says more than 1 million people have now fled from Sudan to neighbouring countries since war broke out between rival military factions in April. More than 3.4 million are believed to be internally displaced. Tom Bailey reports.
These latest figures follow a bleak warning from 20 international agencies that the situation in Sudan was spiralling out of control, with millions on the verge of famine and struggling to access healthcare after 4 months of war. Fighting between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary rapid support forces has devastated the capital Khartoum and sparked ethnically driven violence in Darfur. Efforts led by Saudi Arabia and the United States to negotiate a ceasefire have largely stalled, with humanitarian agencies struggling to provide the aid that is clearly so desperately needed.
Scientists say that for the first time they've reconstructed a song by analysing recordings of brainwaves. They used artificial intelligence to decode the 10-year-old recordings of epilepsy patients who'd listened to Another Brick in the Wall, a 1979 hit by the British band Pink Floyd. The scientists at University of California, Berkeley, hope their work could help people with impaired speech from strokes and other brain injuries speak more naturally via improved implants and other assistive technologies. President Biden says he will travel to Hawaii as soon as he can, amid criticism of his response to the deadly wildfires there. Many Hawaii residents have complained about the pace of the federal government's response to the disaster, but the president said all available assets would be used.
My wife Jill and I are going to travel to Hawaii as soon as we can. That's what I've been talking to the governor about. I don't want to get in the way. I've been to too many disaster areas, but I want to go, make sure we got everything they need. I want to be sure we don't disrupt the ongoing recovery efforts. Our thoughts and prayers are with the people of Hawaii.
Meanwhile, the state's governor says the number of people now known to have died has risen to 101. Efforts are continuing to identify victims. You're listening to the latest world news from the BBC. Poland has held its biggest military parade since the Cold War as its military clout grows in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The event in the capital Warsaw marks the Polish defeat of Russian-led Bolshevik forces in 1920. The country is providing extensive military support for neighbouring Ukraine. Speaking at the parade, the Polish President Andrzej Duda said his country has the military capability to defend itself.
For 8 years, we've been strengthening and modernizing our armed forces. We're acquiring modern equipment for our soldiers. This year, we will spend 4% of our GDP on defense. The goal of this extensive modernization is for the Polish army to be so well equipped and for us to have such a defense system that no one will ever dare to attack us.
A former senior FBI counterintelligence officer has pleaded guilty in the United States to taking money from a sanctioned Russian oligarch in exchange for information on a rival. Charles McGonigal, described as the former top spy catcher in New York, received more than $17,000 from Oleg Deripaska. Several West African migrants have been found dead aboard a boat drifting off Cape Verde, along with around 40 survivors. The exact number of casualties is unconfirmed. The boat had reportedly set off from Senegal a month ago with around 100 people on board. It's believed the vessel was heading for the Spanish Canary Islands, a popular gateway for migrants to the European Union. Google has announced plans to train 20,000 Nigerian women and young people in digital skills to support the government targets of creating 1 million tech jobs. It follows talks between Google's Director for West Africa and Nigeria's Vice President Kashim Tahima in Abuja. Welcoming the announcement, Mr. Shatima said President Bola Tinubu's administration was determined to harness the potential of Nigeria's young population to grow the digital sector. BBC News.
Hello, this is Alex Ritson with the newsroom. Nearly a month after Private Second-Class King, a soldier in the United States Army, crossed from South to North Korea, the communist state has for the first time commented on the case. Pyongyang said he admitted that he illegally intruded into the country and that he did so because he faced racial discrimination in the U.S. Army. I heard more from our correspondent in Seoul, Jean McKenzie.
So Travis King was serving in the US Army, but he was actually on deployment here in South Korea, but he'd got into trouble with authorities and he'd spent some time in detention and he was being sent back to the US to be disciplined by the Army, possibly even discharged. But rather than get on his flight the day that he was due to be sent back, he managed to escape from the airport. He booked himself onto this tour of the demilitarized zone, so the border between North Korea, and this is the point which he ran across the border and essentially has disappeared into North Korean custody. And until now, we hadn't heard the North Koreans publicly confirm that they had him in the country.
So this claim of racial discrimination in the US Army came from the state news agency of North Korea. What else did it say?
Yeah, so they released a statement on their news agency early this morning, a short statement, but they said that Travis King had crossed into the north because he had been inhumanely treated in the army and racially discriminated against. They also said that he was disillusioned with inequality in America, and so he'd wanted to seek asylum in North Korea or a third country. But of course, this is just what the North Koreans are telling us that Travis King has said. We don't have a way to verify it, and even the US Pentagon has said this morning that they can't verify, of course, that this is what Travis King said. But I think it is worth pointing out that Travis King's family gave an interview just a couple of weeks ago to ABC News in America. And in that interview, they did say that Travis King had suggested to them on the phone when they spoke to him that he was experiencing some racism, and also that his mental health had deteriorated prior to him crossing. The other thing to note in this statement is the North Koreans have said that Travis King admitted that he illegally crossed the border, but it doesn't say how he's now going to be treated and whether he's going to be prosecuted for this.
Meanwhile, Washington is still negotiating to try to get Private King back.
Yes, Washington has been trying to negotiate his release from the start using the UN command, so this structure that controls the demilitarized zone. They've been trying to talk to the North Koreans on this direct phone line they have to the North Korean army, but we know the North Koreans have been pretty unresponsive. They've sent one message in which they confirmed that they had Travis King and that they were investigating, but we don't know his whereabouts and we don't know his condition.
Gene McKenzie in Seoul. Warsaw witnessed its biggest military parade in decades on Tuesday, Armed Forces Day, as crowds gathered to mark Poland's victory over the Russian Bolsheviks in the Battle of Warsaw, which took place in 1920. The parade included the latest in military hardware, including American-made tanks and HIMARS rocket launchers, in a show of military muscle amid rising tension over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. NATO member Poland has invested billions of dollars in its military and is playing a key role in supporting Ukraine. Paweł Jablonski is Poland's deputy foreign minister.
In order for Ukraine to take back control, they need additional equipment, they need additional ammo, they need additional missiles, for example, long-range missiles. They have been indicating this. And we are continuously supporting this because we consider this Russian aggression as a threat also to our territory. When we support Ukraine, we do it out of our national interest because we know that we are next in line.
Our correspondent Joe Inwood has been following this for the newsroom.
It's interesting when you look at the pictures, you can see thousands of men marching in close formation. You can see huge and really quite modern pieces of equipment. You were mentioning before HIMARS. Of course, we've heard a lot about them in the war in Ukraine, and as well as self-propelled guns, great big modern M1 Abrams tanks. And clearly this is Poland showing that it has military might. Obviously, throughout the war in Ukraine, the Russians have been careful not to step over the line in terms of attacking directly a NATO country. But I think this kind of show of force from the Poles is designed to reinforce that caution. I think it's also a warning to Belarus, because, of course, Russia's ally, Belarus, who are having, there is some talk of military build-up there, and I think it's also a question of deterring them. But it's also worth pointing out that there's another audience for this. It's not just pointing towards the east, it's also an internal one. There are elections coming up in Poland very soon, and the Law and Justice Party, the ruling party, are keen to show people that they are defending the country, and I think this has to be viewed in that context as well.
This idea that was suggested there by Poland's deputy foreign minister in that clip, that Poland could be next, how real is that fear?
I think the fear is very real. I think it's very understandable, given what we've seen in Ukraine. I think it's very understandable that Poland and the Baltic states, who have, of course, lived under Soviet rule, under, as they would see, the sort of the yoke of Russia before, are very concerned around military build-up. Whether it's going to happen is it's an incredibly difficult question to answer, and I think many people have different views in it. I think current thinking is it's not likely that Russia will directly intervene or try and invade Poland at this point. However, there is another threat I alluded to slightly before, and that is coming from Belarus and the Wagner mercenary group. Now, listeners will remember the uprising, the failed coup in Russia a few months ago by this Wagner mercenary group, a very dangerous fighting force. Now, after the failed coup, they were relocated to Belarus, which of course shares a land border with Poland, and there's been quite a lot of talk of the Wagner fighters that were kicked out of Russia moving towards the border with Poland. Now, we don't know the truth of any of this, but certainly it's something the Poles are concerned about. They've indeed moved 10,000 troops to that border in order to try and give some extra support to their border guards. And I think that's because there is a genuine concern that the Wagner forces, which are to some extent a law unto themselves, could take action, could do something.
Joe Inwood.
Ukrainian prisoners of war who've been released in exchanges of captives say they were subjected to torture, including frequent beatings and electric shocks, while in custody at a facility in southwestern Russia. Our correspondent Hugo Beshega tracked down some of the Ukrainians who were held in Taganrog to hear their stories.
The former prisoners describe a consistent pattern of extreme violence at the facility in Taganrog. They say detainees are repeatedly beaten, including in the kidneys and chest, and given electric shocks during inspections and interrogations. They claim captives are also constantly left undernourished, and those who are injured do not receive adequate health care, with reports of prisoners dying at the facility. They describe some detainees giving false confessions under duress, which were then allegedly used as evidence in trials. The Russian Defense Ministry has not responded to requests for comment. The UN Human Rights Office says it has recorded similar cases, but that it has not been allowed to visit facilities with prisoners of war in Russia.
Hugo Beshega. You're listening to the BBC World Service. Our main news, North Korea has said an American soldier who crossed into the country from the south had expressed ill feeling against the US Army. The US President Joe Biden says he will travel to Hawaii as soon as he can to survey the damage and meet survivors of the wildfires that have killed more than 100 people. Hundreds are still missing, and the authorities who've begun to name those killed say they expect the number of dead to rise as searches continue. There are fears the island of Maui is about to be hit by more storms. Our correspondent Sophie Long reports from the devastated town of Lahaina.
Survivors say the sound of the wind that night was like the roar of a jet plane. Exploding cars, like bombs going off.
No. Oh, damn, it's hot. Okay, come inside.
They describe how the smoke made them choke and vomit as they ran for their lives with their backs burning.
And everything starts, so I look to my left, and I'm literally right next to this car where this grandmother is yelling for help, and she's just telling me, please help me, I have a baby.
Fleeing for her life with her own 3 children, Akanasi Va carried another little girl to safety. Her own children were old enough to run.
We run to the corner and we meet up. We meet there and we just notice that we're at a dead end. You know, my son was like, oh, Mom, is this it? And I mean, what do you tell your kids?
Just the one thing that you were about the batteries.
Save some for them, but there's a pallet right there and there's a pallet jack.
Nearly a week later, and local people like Amory Mowry continue to load cars with supplies they say people still desperately need.
So we're just trying to get supplies as fast as possible into the affected areas so that people get what they need. There was a lack of response, it felt like, from larger organizations.
We followed Amory's convoy into the worst affected area. The views along the way were a reminder of what makes Maui so magical. As we arrived on the outskirts of Lahaina, we saw what's broken its heart. The once colourful, historic town has been transformed into a bleak moonscape, where many of its inhabitants remain unrecovered. Some of the houses that survived have become unofficial aid hubs. People like Alex Freeman are doing their best to distribute the donations coming in, but he, like others who remain, are frustrated by the lack of clear information.
We got another hurricane that could touch down, tropical depression, and I barely have data in and out. So we don't know what's going on weather-wise. We don't know what's going on down the street unless somebody comes and tell us.
So you've got no power, no running water?
So it depends who you ask. And I got the official notice of contamination for water. Somebody at the hotel knows a guy that says, hey, it's okay. Somebody that says, hey, do not. Don't even wash your dishes. Conflicting information constantly. Some people tell us that people down the street don't even know we're here. No communication whatsoever.
And how do you feel when you look at what's happened?
I mean, it's devastating. I mean, you can't even fathom that, like, right on the other side of that wall are corpses. Like, it's literally right there.
The children a few doors down were here in Lahaina as it burned, their parents unable to get back from work. It was an excruciating 48 hours before Lordy Boonagar learned if her 5-year-old son had survived. And all that time you didn't know what had happened to him?
No, I don't know. We're alive. That's all that matters right now.
What happened here was one of the most horrifying and lethal disasters to take place in the United States for many years. Nearly a week later, and the search and recovery operation is still ongoing. Hawaii's Governor, Josh Green, says he expects the search teams to recover between 10 and 20 bodies every day until their grim and difficult task is done. He couldn't say when that would be.
Sophie Long with that report. Let's go now to some of the fallout from the indictments brought against former President Donald Trump and his associates in Georgia for allegedly trying to overturn his 2020 election defeat illegally. He's now promised to provide information which will exonerate him, while the former White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, is seeking to move the case against him to a federal court. I asked our North America correspondent Peter Bowes first about Mr. Meadows.
Well, Mark Meadows is trying to get the case moved from state to federal court so that, in effect, he can try to get it dismissed under federal law. So how would he do that? Well, he's arguing that he is entitled to bring a federal immunity defense because the Georgia state charges against him stem from his conduct as Chief of Staff to the sitting President, Donald Trump. And this is a request on his own behalf. It wouldn't, even if successful, take the entire case involving the 18 other defendants to federal court. It's something that will be decided on an individual basis. Interestingly, though, there is some reporting here that this could also be the strategy of Donald Trump, he also being a federal employee at the time. And Rudy Giuliani, Mr. Trump's former lawyer, who's also charged, raised the issue during a radio show on Tuesday, saying that he believed the case against him qualified for almost automatic removal to federal court. So the lawyers on both sides are going to be very busy on that one. As for former President Trump promising to provide information that will exonerate him, he says he'll hold this news conference on Monday of next week. He posted this. He said, a large, complex, detailed but irrefutable report on the presidential election fraud which took place in Georgia is almost complete and will be presented by me at a major news conference. It would be stunning if irrefutable evidence emerges, given that ever since the disputed election, Mr. Trump and his team have been challenging the result, but no official or court has come down on his side.
Peter Bowes. Sports news now. Here's Colm Harrison.
Thanks, Alex. Either England or Australia will be playing in their first Women's World Cup final on Sunday. The two sides meet in the second semi-final in Sydney in a few hours from now at 10 a.m. GMT. Australia went into the tournament with their hopes largely resting on star striker Sam Kerr, but she's played only 75 minutes of football in their 5 games so far as she makes her way back to full fitness from a calf injury. England's head coach Serena Wigman says it proves that Australia are not a one-woman team.
Well, of course, she's a very good player, so lots of respect. But there's more than Sam Kerr, and because at the end it's always a team performance, and that's the same for Australia, it's the same for England. So yes, a lot of pressure on her because everyone expects things from her and for the team. I think Australia grew in the tournament too. They had some disappointing situations too where they had to come back from, and they did really well. So yeah, we expect a very strong Australia tomorrow.
Well, Spain are waiting for the winners after their 2-1 victory over Sweden in Auckland, so they now have a first World Cup final to look forward to. Here's Spanish defender Irina Paredes.
Well, it's Spanish history, and that's all. It's amazing. We made history playing the quarters, so coming to the final, it's just amazing. Of course, the players, we know how good we are, how good is this team, and we have to keep pushing.
One other football line, Brazilian star Neymar has completed his move from the French champions Paris Saint-Germain to Saudi Pro League side Al Hilal. The fee is $98 million plus add-ons. He signed a 2-year contract set to be worth an eye-watering $325 million. Tennis defending champion Borna Coric is through to the second round of the Cincinnati Open after beating Sebastian Korda in straight sets. There were also wins for Taylor Fritz, Alexander Zverev and Tommy Paul, amongst others, in the men's singles. The number 13 seed Cameron Norrie of Great Britain is out, though. He was beaten in 3 sets by the Frenchman Gael Monfils. In the women's singles, the Wimbledon champion Marketa Vondrousova, Petra Kvitova and Victoria Azarenka are all through to round 2. So is the number 5 seed Ons Jabeur, but the defending champion Caroline Garcia is out. She was beaten in 3 sets by Sloane Stephens. Alex.
Thank you, Colm Harrison. The Knights Templar, it's a name redolent with arcane medieval activities surrounding Jerusalem, the Pope and the Crusades, and picked up in the Da Vinci Code, where it was associated with hidden treasure. Now, a different type of treasure has come to light. Templar graves have been found in an unexpected location in central England. Terry Egan has this report.
It was, in the Middle Ages, one of the most influential religious organizations around, with chapters all over Europe, the Knights Templar. Their task was to keep pilgrims to Jerusalem safe, but they accrued huge wealth with land and castles around Jerusalem, Tripoli and Antioch, as well as in Europe. Now, 8 Templar graves have been uncovered in the obscure location of St. Mary's Church in the village of Enville in the centre of England. One of the graves is marked with a Crusader cross, suggesting the occupant was both a Templar and a Crusader. Why there? Well, the historians who found the graves have been speculating. The stained glass window of the little church displays a coat of arms belonging to someone called Hugh Mortimer. He married the granddaughter of a man called William Marshall, who'd been one of the most important men in England and was himself a Knight Templar. His link to Hugh Mortimer may be why so many of the knights were buried in Enville. If the church were under the patronage of the Templars, that would make it one of the most important Templar churches in England.
Terry Egan with that report. 11 people have died in an explosion at a shop in the Dominican Republic. 10 people are missing and dozens more are injured. A huge column of smoke was seen rising from the site near the capital, San Dominico. On a visit to the area, the president of the Caribbean nation, Luis Abinader, said a probe had been launched.
An investigation will be carried out to determine the origin and causes of this terrible accident. In the meantime, it is up to us to save the lives of those who have been affected, and we will do so without any limit of resources to save every human life we can with God's help.
The cause of the blast is unclear. It's hard to believe, but scientists have, for the first time, managed to record and turn into sound the brainwaves of a group of patients with the help of the rock band Pink Floyd and artificial intelligence. In effect, they were eavesdropping on people undergoing surgery for epilepsy while they were listening to the song Another Brick in the Wall. A team at the University of California, Berkeley, carried out the research. I've been speaking to one of the study's authors, Ludovic Bellier. He says he hopes that this will help pave the way for technology to help people with impaired speech.
We had the idea to use that data set to see whether we could decode the music, the song, and if we could do this, it means that we could potentially one day include some prosodic elements, like the melody, the rhythm of the voice, to speech decoding devices, and to restore communication in patients with, for instance, ALS or aphasia, who could not communicate vocally with their loved ones, in order to make the voices more realistic.
How did you technically do this? How did you, in simple terms that a non-scientific person like me can understand, how did you turn brainwaves into music?
So, have you heard about machine learning?
Tell me more.
Yeah, so machine learning is basically algorithms that can learn by themselves. And they can learn relationships. For instance, we have the neural activity that is elicited by listening to the song. If you can imagine a very simple kind of relationship, let's say you hear one note, there's activity at a given electrode. You hear another note, there's activity at another electrode maybe. Then, if you don't know the note that were played, but you just look at the neural activity on these electrodes, so machine learning models are able to really extract meaning from super complex enriched data sets, such as the one we have, and from learning the relationship between the neural activity and the acoustics of the song, that's how we were able to reconstruct the song.
Why did you choose that track, Another Brick in the Wall?
That's a great question. It's a super simple answer. It's just because everyone loves Pink Floyd. and our collaborators at the Albany Medical Center choose that song for that reason. They love Pink Floyd, that's why they use it.
And it is extraordinary to listen to the recording you made, because there is feeling in what you've created. Emotion is transmitted with the words.
Yeah, so that's what we hope to include in speech decoding devices down the line. Here we really decode the acoustics of the song, so that's more the artist who made the song that way, that conveys emotion. But we're really aiming for reconstructing the sounds. What really where my heart is at is to help patients with impaired communication to really be able to control how they speak, not just what they say, not just the linguistic information, but also how they say it. It can change completely the meaning of a sentence given how you say it. If you say it in an angry voice, in a calm voice, etc., it can really change the meaning. So giving them more control in order to communicate better. Down the line, maybe in 5 years, 10 years, that would be fantastic to have the ability to restore speech with a more realistically sounding output.
Genuinely extraordinary. Ludovic Bellier from the University of California, Berkeley. The main news, North Korea has said an American soldier who crossed into the country from the south had expressed ill feeling against the US Army. Plenty more in the Global News podcast, which is made by the same team. For now, thanks for listening to the Newsroom.
This is the BBC World Service, with a story about architecture, ambition and power.
In India, a new parliament building has been built to replace its colonial-era predecessor.
It sends a very powerful message to the world that India is moving forward.
I'm Shalu Yadav in Delhi. I'm finding out what the new parliament tells us about modern India.
This is not just a building of parliament, but it is the reflection of ambitions and dreams of 1.4 billion people of India.
But others see the project differently. It was the Prime Minister who took it upon himself to treat this as his sort of personal glorification. The soul of democracy has been sucked out of Parliament. There is no value in a new building. We are all spectators of this great circus.
Building Power, India's new Parliament. Tuesday at 8:30 and 19 GMT.